Hello, everyone. We're just going to give a couple of minutes to allow participants to join in on the webinar. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to our panel, Arms Exports to Conflict Areas, Engaging Youth in Countering Militarism. We are so excited to be speaking with you all today. I am Bea Arneson, the Outreach Coordinator for the World Peace Foundation's Defense Industries, Foreign Policy and Armed Conflict Program, and I'm the Research Coordinator for the Corruption Tracker Project. In March, we released 3 reports that found that despite state commitments to upholding the protection of human rights and international humanitarian law, the outbreak of war or conflict has little to no restraining effect on US, UK, or French exports, even when blatant violations of human rights and humanitarian law are documented. Today, we will explore how activists might leverage these insights to advocate for change. If you have any questions throughout this event, please leave them in the chat and we will make sure to address them at the end of the presentations. And just a note on that, if you are trying to ask a question to a specific panelist, please make sure to indicate that in your questions. Okay, first, I'm super honored to introduce my coworker and friend, Ruth. Ruth is the co-founder and program manager of the Corruption Tracker Project and the research associate at Shadow World Investigations. She is a graduate student in international history and politics at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, Switzerland. Ruth is also a dedicated member of the German peace movement, campaigning for nuclear disarmament against the arms trade and for a world founded on peace and solidarity nationally and internationally. Without further ado, please go ahead and start, Ruth.
Thank you so much, B. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. It's a great honor. I'm just gonna share my screen. B, if you just want to give me a quick thumbs up if you can see. Perfect. Great. Okay. So to start us off with, I would like to talk to you about how we can go from making a killing to making a change on arms exports to regions of conflict and what we can do about them. So specifically, what I want to talk about is the problem that we have with conflict and arms export restraints. Then I want to take 3 observations from the reports written under the Defense Industries Foreign Policy and Armed Conflict Program, and also address a little bit what we can do about them. And throughout this, I want to draw some connections to corruption. And this is, as B already mentioned, because I am a program manager at the Corruption Tracker project, which aims to create an up-to-date online database of all cases and robust allegations of corruption in the arms trade. So we basically document, we also inform publicly about corruption in the arms trade. And then I want to talk about these reports that have been published by the World Peace Foundation under their Defense Industries Foreign Policy and Conflict Research series, and see how they link to corruption. So as Bia already sort of mentioned, the key challenge that has been identified in the reports is that there's very little evidence that war or armed conflict leads to restraints in arms transfers by major exporters, regardless of their stated policies. And so the country reports that the World Peace Foundation published on France, the UK, and the United States then look at the question why this is the case for these major exporters. And there are a few lessons that we can draw from these reports. And these are maybe not the most obvious parts of the reports, but just some parts that I really want to highlight. So first of all, a few of these reports talk about the arms trade as a relationship. Then they talk about the role of time in risk assessment and the key to changing anything about this, which comes through political will. And I hope these will become clearer as we go through. So first of all, the reports by the World Peace Foundation call us to think about the arms trade as a relationship. So as Sam Perlow-Freeman already points out, an established arms supply relationship is one of the most powerful determinants of whether arms transfers would occur in the future, regardless of recipients' conflict status. And similarly, Jennifer Erickson concludes for the United States that it is maybe conflict can deter the US from forming new supply relationships, but it is unlikely to change export patterns where relationships already exist. And so I want to dig a little bit deeper into this concept of relationships, because I think we have to move on when we think about relationships between states from this realist conception of a state as a black box and states somehow engaging with each other. No, we have people in those states and they engage with each other, and the domestic dimensions of this are, of course, the relationships between governments and their arms industries nationally, but simultaneously we also have relationships between international arms dealers, people in international governments, in the industry, people, of course, going through the revolving doors, and sometimes these are the same people. And of course, the fact that some governments double as arms sellers, basically, for their arms industries. And so when we start thinking about these relationships as shaped by people, we start to see that there's a lot of potential for corruption in the international arms trade. As a matter of fact, in the 1990s, it was estimated that corruption makes up 40% of all corruption, all global transactions. It's kind of hard to get a reliable estimate on this, but this is the best estimate that we have. And Joe Rober, an expert from Transparency International, who also came up with this statistic, believed that removing or significantly reducing corruption would do more to reform the arms trade than any other single act. And it's easy to see why, because corruption is at the heart of many arms procurement decisions. It is how some of these strategic relationships are developed over time. And it is also something that leads to an inflation in the trade, as some arms deals would not occur or would occur very differently if corruption wasn't in the picture. And so just very briefly, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but an example of this, you might want to think about the UK Saudi Arabia arms deal, especially the Al Yamama arms deals, which were a series of arms for oil deals conducted from 1985, and that were worth over 43 billion pounds by 2007. Early commissions in these deals raised the Tornado fighter jets price that Saudi Arabia wanted to buy by 32%, which just goes to show that this is a case where arms exports where arms became like artificially expensive for the buying state, but also this was used to cultivate relationships. You have the Saudi ambassador to the United States at the time, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, allegedly receiving 1.2 billion pounds, this is not million, billion in bribes. Margaret Thatcher, the UK Prime Minister, lobbying for this deal to go through, her son Mark allegedly acting as an agent. You have arms relationships already before Al Yamama, where commissions of up to 15% have been paid. Commissions in the arms trade is sometimes a nice way to say bribes. And then finally, you have an investigation into this deal by the UK Serious Fraud Office, shut down by Tony Blair. And basically what you see here is how an arms deal relationships or an arms trading relationships is carried on from one government to the next and is facilitated and smoothed out by corrupt practices with some of the individuals involved. And then, of course, how these weapons end up in conflict, as we've seen with Saudi Arabia's use of these weapons in Yemen. So this is the relationship aspect. The second aspect that I wanted to talk about is this aspect of the arms trade in time. So as Anna Stavrianakis and also Emma Soubrier point out, for example, the United Kingdom and France are parties to international legislation that requires risk assessment in selling weapons. So countries have to assess, for example, whether there's a potential that their weapon could be used to commit serious humanitarian rights violations. However, there is a crucial element of time here because, as Anna Stavrianakis points out, these risk assessments often don't actually look back. So then you can ask, okay, so what is a risk assessment based on if it doesn't take previous data into consideration? So, and if we're already thinking that this is a problem with things like humanitarian harm, corruption is even less considered as a factor. Many Western companies have been involved in provenly corrupt arms deals repeatedly with barely any sanctioning or implications for future deals. For example, only in 2020, Airbus agreed to pay nearly 3.7 billion euros to settle bribery charges for more than a decade in which the firm bribed officials in 16 countries to push them to buy aircraft and satellites. So it is completely unclear how this would ever impact a future licensing process concerning Airbus, which is a major arms exporting or arms selling company. So what can we do about this particular element? I think if we think about cutting corruption in the arms trade as one way of countering problematic tendencies in the arms trade, in general, we have to think about information gathering, about providing the data that can show that our governments have this information about human rights violations, about corruption at their disposal, and they're choosing to ignore it. So examples of this are, of course, the corruption tracker itself, but also the amazing work that the World Peace Foundation has been doing. And then obviously there's plenty of other databases. I put for you here a Belgian organization that tracks the use of European weapons in Yemen. So we can just show with this data collection that there is actual data, that we have knowledge about these things, and our governments, as I said, are choosing to ignore this information. So finally, my final point is that I want to highlight is this issue of political will, because all of these realizations are very interesting and very important, but we have to put them into practice, right? So we have to, if the goal is to change the arms trades, at least so that we won't have weapons ending up in regions of conflict anymore, we have to do something about this. And the key to this, as Anna Stavrianakis already points out, is political will. And why is political will so key? One of the reasons is that legislation isn't always effective when we're talking about the arms trade. This is because arms trade decisions are often difficult to or impossible in some constituencies. For example, in Germany, it's virtually impossible to challenge arms export licenses in court. These decisions are seen as part of executive privilege, which might apparently lead some governments to think that it's above the law, or at least you can bend the law a very long way. And also legislation can sometimes serve to legitimate the arms trade actually. So we cannot rely on legislation alone to bring the desired effect of reducing arms exports that fuel conflict. And so I think a key takeaway, and I know that the other people on this panel, who are, by the way, just amazing, will talk about this much more than I will, is that we have to create political will through other avenues. We have to pursue strategic litigation. We have to pursue direct actions and international cooperation on all of these issues. And also we have to support good journalism on these topics. So in conclusion, kind of a new point, but something that I really want us to take away is that it is important that we treat failures of arms export regulations as a structural problem. So what do I mean by this? What I mean is that the problem is not with an individual policy or even less with an individual exporting decisions. All of these reports have, and these are actually not the first reports to show this, right? We have years and decades of data that show that there is a structural issues with states providing and Western states providing arms against their own promises to protect human rights, international humanitarian law, and keep weapons out of conflict. So the problem is really a structural one. And of course, the failure to create effective arms export control legislation and the failure of creating political will have to do with how the world is organized. And this is why it's so important to keep thinking of these things as interconnected with other structures that uphold the power relationships that all of this is based on: imperialism, racism, militarism, fossil fuel dependence. You can really, capitalism itself, you can really pick your poison on this. However, there are some shorter term things that we can do to challenge these structures and move forward in this, which is, first of all, removing wrong incentives in the arms trade, which for me really starts with countering corruption. We have to become better at myth busting and continue doing it. And especially also part of this is to distinguish between what is real change in export policy and what is just states performing good international citizenship and thereby legitimating their problematic practices. Thank you so much.
Ruth, this is exactly why I love working with you at the Corruption Tracker. You were such a brilliant being. Thank you so much for your presentation. And next, we will be having Alice speak. Alice is the Research and Events Officer for the French NGO Stop Fueling War. Her research work covers issues related to arms transfers, peace building initiatives, or military spending. She also hosts Stop Fueling War's French podcast, which I will make sure to link in the chat. She holds a master's in political science, specialized in conflict and peace studies from Radboud University, and wrote her master's thesis on the evaluation of disarmament programs efficacy in 4 countries of Southeast Asia. She previously worked for Risk & Co. in Paris, a risk assessment company, at the Stockholm Korea Center for the ISDP, and at the political section of the EUDEL to the Philippines as an intern. Alice, please go ahead and start your presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It's really a great opportunity to be able to talk with this great panel. So I'm gonna talk about the case of France more specifically, and I just want to start with some numbers for the context. France is the 3rd largest exporter in the world for arms, according to CIPRI, just behind the US and Russia. And it accounted for 8.2% of the global market between 2016 and 2020, and 11% of the global market between 2017 and 2021, which means that there has been an increase of plus 59% of French arms exports in the world. So you can see the gap here between France and the following biggest exporters, China and Germany. So there is quite a considerable gap. And I just wanted to also provide you with the top clients of the French arms from the report of Emma Soubrier, Weaponized Storytelling. So Egypt was the first one between 2011 and 2020, then Qatar, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. So not a lot of, I mean, you can spot several authoritarian regimes there. And I want to talk more about the doctrine of France on the arms exports, because that's very specific to France. So there is a strong idea about the strategic autonomy, which dates back to the start of the current political regimes, where de Gaulle really wanted to have an independent and autonomous army that could have its own equipments with national production. But the French market for arms is very small compared to the US, for example. So it led to the argument of saying that exports are necessary to sustain the economic model of the arms industry. But in fact, it's not entirely about economic, it's more of a political choice. And that's how we see the arms export as a tool for foreign policy, to build strategic partnership with importers for security. And the government often describe the control regime as strict, transparent, and responsible. And I would like you to remind this sentence, because it's that's quite a bold assessment. So we are trying to challenge that, and I'm talking as Stop Fueling War. So this is the NGO I'm working for. It's a French NGO based in Paris, quite new because it has been created in 2017. We produce bilingual content, English and French, because we have Europe-wide membership. It was created by activists that were protesting the Paris Arms Fair, Eurosatory. It's one of the biggest in Europe. And the next one is in June 2022. We're working hard on the campaign, so if you want more information on our website, or if you want to get in touch, please don't hesitate. And we are trying to challenge the current security and defense status quo, raising awareness to tackle the arms trade and highlight alternatives based on peace building. And yeah, so the bottom line of the report is to say that French arms are in conflict zone and they're still delivered to conflict zones. So according to the report, business as usual, for France, conflict appears to be associated with a higher probability of transfers. I think, I don't have time to talk for each example, but I think the Ukraine-Russia situation is quite important here, because France kept on delivering arms and military equipment after the 2014 embargo that was voted at the EU Parliament. And the government justified it because it's legal according to a condition which is called the grandpa or the grandfather measures or something like that, that say that you can still deliver weapons even after an embargo if the contract was signed before the start of the embargo. So we kept on delivering equipment for Russian tanks, for example, but there has been a big mobilization from the EU members and also the public against the delivery of 2 warships, so the 2 Mistral in 2015, and France had backed up on it. It took them several months, probably because they were, I mean, we don't know exactly, but they were trying to resell them to Egypt, which they managed to. but that shows that it's possible to decide to not continue delivering weapons to conflict zones. And it has been possible for the two warships, but they still decided to keep on with the rest of the material. It's entirely linked to political will, and it's led me to wonder about the protection of civilians. Because if we have a strict, transparent, and responsible control system, then we shouldn't find any French weapons in Ukraine or in Yemen. So just to give you a bit of background on the system in France, it is supposed to be a prohibition system, so production or the selling of weapons is forbidden. You need to be granted authorization by the prime minister, and to that he will consult the CMEG, so the first word up there, which is an interministerial commission with 3 ministers, and they will give the prime minister services their opinion about the transfer based on a risk assessment. But the issue here is that it's still the state, the government controlling its own action. There is no parliamentary oversight in France, and compared to other European countries, it's very, very limited. And it can be explained by the very strong relationship between the administration and the industry. About transparency, there is one report that the Minister of Armies published to the Parliament every year, but it's very limited in the precision of data is very limited. The debates that goes with it are very limited, and there is a broad consensus in the political parties for arms exports, which makes it even more challenging because no one is gonna really ask for more at the parliament. So we are also facing a lack of data. More and more data are actually put under secret classification, and a poor reporting to the official legal framework that France should report to. We've seen a bit of improvement because some of the ATT reports have been included in the 2020 annual parliamentary report, but there is still a lot of room for improvement. And I also want to highlight that responsibility is different from legality. So the main argument for France about their exports to conflict areas is that it was legal. So they could, but they didn't have to. And what we think is that they should not. So France is a signatory of the Arms Trade Treaty, the EU common position, actually pushed for the ATT. And the lack of control for the endorsement of those treaties led to the civil society and NGOs in France to step up and actually launch lawsuits against the French government for the arms sale to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates that were involved in Yemen. So this is the association ACER that launched those lawsuits, if you want to follow their work. And it's now in like a second appeal, kind of. So we're still waiting on the decision, but very, very important action. And I also wanted to highlight that another consequences of the French arms trade is corruption and revolving doors. As Ruth just said before, I think revolving doors for France in the arms trade is huge. The best example is Thierry Breton, former CEO of Atos, which is a company involved in defense and surveillance technologies, and now he's the European Commissioner for the Internal Market, also in charge of defense, which with a huge action scope that was actually pushed for by Emmanuel Macron. And I'm sure you've heard about all the corruption affairs. I'm not a specialist on corruption, but I don't know if there is any government, French government under the Fifth Republic that didn't have any corruption allegations with an arms trade deal. So this is a small table from Transparency International that they scored the corruption risk for the biggest arms companies in France. So you have Airbus, Dassault, MBDA, Naval Group, and Nexter. And it's ranked from A being the best grade possible to E. So you can see that the corruption risks are actually quite high, and the commitment to anti-corruption policies are low for Dassault and Nexter. Quite important when you know how many Rafale Dassault has sold the past year. And I wanted to emphasize the recommendations that are in the reports that Emma Soubrier wrote on France, which are really interesting. I think Ruth really talked about the time frame, for example. I want to pick up on the political will aspects. I think one of our biggest issue in France is the lack of political will. We have several reports from parliamentaries are actually asking to implement more control at the parliamentary level, but it hasn't been followed suit. And a journal called Disclose, which do amazing investigation work on the arms trade, they actually revealed that the government is trying to bury this report. So very bad news. Yeah, so confer oversight power to the parliament. I think that will be the key right now to leave this control system where the government decide on the exports and control its own exports. And yeah, I was also interested by the fifth recommendation, which is encourage a different kind of strategic conversation, moving beyond binary positions. I'm struggling to find those positions in the public discussion in France right now, because if you're asking for more control, you're going to be labeled or against the trade, but there are no real politicians or political actors that are actually against the arms trade. So that's a difficult things to implement. And so I wanted to give you also a bit of an idea of what we are trying to implement for the future. So we just had the presidential election in France with Macron being back re-elected. So it's not a very good sign for more control and more transparency, more responsibility for French exports, since he hasn't shown a lot of interest in the previous years. We have the parliamentary elections coming up, and I think that's our best shot at improving these aspects. The civil society has the biggest role to play in France because political actors are not at it when it comes to political will. So that's what we are trying to do with Stop Fueling War. We are trying to inform people about the size and the impacts of the arms trade in France. So we have a podcast with French, and we're trying to do more and more English episodes. We did an exhibitions. We are trying to produce as much publication as possible for education, to raise awareness. And I think that's the main challenge in France right now, because it's very difficult to make it an issue in a country where it's seen as a consensual subject. So I think that's it for me.
Thank you so much, Alice. That was incredibly informative, and I think you spoke to a lot of the difficulties with addressing French exports. Next, we are going to have my friend Melina, who we luckily met in Barcelona when we were there doing a presentation. Melina is the co-founder and research director of Demilitarize Education, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to end the ties that universities in the UK have with the global arms trade. Deducation has created an arms and universities database tracking the money held at universities that comes from the defense contractors and the defense industry. She is also the co-founder and lead of the Minorities in Peace and Security organization, working to see more people of color at the forefront of policy making and security. Go ahead and start, Melina. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bea. Hi, everyone. Thanks for such an introduction. Before I start, I'd like to just reiterate the fact that I'm just blown away by the people with whom I'm sharing a panel with today. I think we're all amazing and we all rock, and yes. So just want to start on that positive note. So as Bea mentioned, I'm Melina, co-founder and research director to Demilitarize Education, which is the hat I'll be wearing today because I wear many hats. I've actually taken a look at the report written by Anna Stavrianakis, who looked at UK arms export trends over the last 10 years and how they have affected conflict across the world. And I'm here mostly to discuss how young people can act from the findings of this report. As an organization that works to see UK universities end their ties to the arms trade, this kind of report is vital for us to understand the landscape of the industry in order to appeal our university administrations to change their ways. In times like these, where there's a war on European soil, these kinds of reports are vital. And it's especially a weird scenario considering the fact that the UK is one of the most committed to the protection of human rights, at least on the outside and to the public. There seems to be a disconnect between policy and practice. And this disconnected theme is not just in this governmental political sphere, it actually exists elsewhere as well, but I'm getting ahead of myself here, so let me set the scene a bit better. Oh, wow, okay. It's my first time using Canva to do a presentation, so I'm very excited. So Anna's report and the conclusions that she drew were not a surprise. I put the 6 conclusions up for you to read in your own time, but we might as well go through them, right? So the first being the misuse of UK supplied weapons is a routine feature of wars involving UK customers, for instance, like Saudi Arabia and the war in Yemen. Arms export licensing practice takes a very narrow interpretation of risk, operating as if neither the past nor the future exist. And I would even go as far to say as like, there is little to no risk assessment done, but that's just my opinion. Self-serving reviews of licensing process, but not policy, take place when controversy is generated, because, hindsight is always 20/20. So why put things in place before they happen, right? The UK's licensing criteria have politically and legally ambiguous effects that ultimately serve to facilitate rather than restrict exports. The committees on arms export controls have played a political fluctuating role in accountability. And finally, there is a mutually supportive, entrenched, and organic relationship between the UK state's geopolitical ambitions and the interests of UK-based industry. So these findings are quite damning and frankly a bit scary when you think about how much the UK government is able to get away with when it comes to arms exports and transfers. This country is supposed to be a beacon of democracy and due process, yet you have policies, laws, and processes written with loopholes or narrow definitions to escape the accountability mechanisms within the processes, right? And I think that this is kind of a theme that if you are to get any sort of theme away from my part in this panel, is the fact that those who write the rules don't have to abide by them, basically. And yeah, the idea of accountability is something that is quite nuanced and narrow, I guess, when it comes to this environment. But anyway, I'm here as Demilitarized Education, right? So where do universities fit into this process of arms exporting and all that great, horrible stuff? There's 4 major ways in which universities exist within the arms industry and ultimately contribute to the military-industrial complex. This is not just limited to universities as institutions, but consequently also with, student help, quote unquote, and student labor. Through research collaborations, graduate schemes, academic partnerships, and investments. I actually recently found out from someone in our demilitarization network that it is possible for arms companies like BAE Systems to rent buildings that belong to a university. So that's also a way in which a university may be making money thanks to the arms trade, or at least through an arms company. These instances, like the 4 I've just shown on screen, are always presented as innovative, and it's an honor to be able to be involved in these projects. And this is when you get to see a lovely blend of like patriarchy and patriotism take place, when in reality it just solidifies a mutual reliance between higher education institutions and the arms industry. So for instance, myself and my co-founder Jinsella, who's here with us today, hi Jinsella, we went and spoke with the University of Manchester's head of sustainability, having both graduated from the University of Manchester. And when we asked him, hi, you guys have a socially responsible investment policy, yet, we know that some of these investments are not so socially responsible, like the ones with the arms trade. He basically kind of told us that it's like, not a necessary evil, but definitely something that, oh, well, a university needs to have a fund, a university needs money. And, who are we to say what we should or shouldn't be getting involved with? If students want to study things that would have to do with defense, we need to be able to provide them the space in order to do so. Gave us 1,000,001 excuses. And also kind of told us like, hey, I too was once young and I was excited about changing the world. So, like, it is what it is. It's just not okay. But anyway, like government, most universities have policies in place, right, to instill a culture and a habit, of sustainability, like this socially responsible investment policy. But what we found was that often these are not fully applicable, as there are loopholes within them, like the concept of academic freedom, or even, the existence of dual use companies, which I'll go into in a bit. So the theory of these policies is brilliant, but the practice, not so brilliant, because they're not really practiced ultimately. And this actually doesn't just apply to the arms trade either. The same higher education institutions that pledge to reduce their carbon footprint have research collaborations with some of the world's largest oil distributors. And as much as they want to combat racism, for example, keeping active ties with the arms trade directly negates their efforts. So ultimately, again, there's the question of like, there's policy and then there's practice. And in both the government space and in a space like a higher education institution, there seems to be a disconnect between the two existing in inducive space. I don't know what I was trying to say here, but basically it's not working. Long story short. So I know right now this sounds like all doom and gloom and terrifying and everything, but I have some good news. Direct action can work. So that is very exciting. And also, I don't know if you're aware, but like the youth of today, they are active and they are aware of what's happening, and they have access to so much information and so many resources that, like, when I was their age, I would have thought, oh, this is too complicated, I can't get involved, right? And one thing that I've noticed in recent years, especially since myself and Jinsella started education, is that intersectionality is an amazing tool that we have to address the ills of the world we are trying to eradicate. So for instance, when I was mentioning earlier that the misalignment of university policy and practice doesn't just exist in the arms trade space, we're able to use intersectionality to highlight the fact that actually it's almost like it's a systemic problem as opposed to an issue specific problem. And again, I mean, this government, the UK government, as much as they pledge to reduce their carbon footprint and help fight climate crisis, ultimately they don't really do that, because even any sort of involvement with the arms trade directly goes against the efforts to combat the climate crisis. So anyway, when you put together an intersectional approach to peace building with an active group of young adults, you get renewed momentum. And renewed momentum gets things done like shutting down an arms factory here in Oldham, in Greater Manchester. Now, this factory, the Elbit factory, is a Israeli-owned factory, and it was basically sold to another person. I put everything up on the screen because there's lots of like names and back and forths, and it's all very businessy. But the point is that for 18 months, Palestine Action and others were relentless in their efforts to get this factory shut down. And eventually it did happen. And I think that seeing, young people seeing something like this happen and take place shows that direct action does work. It takes time, and it doesn't necessarily just look like occupying a building or hitting the street with, a placard and chants and stuff, but there's a lot of ways in which we can all help each other to basically get things done. This was a massive win to them, and I'm so, proud of them and everything, because yeah, they truly deserve to have this win, but it's not over, right? There's more factories to shut down. There's more things that need to come to an end. And I think this is especially interesting when you then look at Anna's report on UK arms export and transfers. She highlights the business and political relationship between the state of Israel and the UK government. And I mean, I would recommend reading the whole report because it really is insightful. It's not crazy long, but long story short, there's a lot of information and weapons sharing between the two countries, despite the fact that Israel is listed by the UK government as a country of concern or human rights priority country. So what does that say about a country that in policy has recognized that the military prowess and threat that prowess poses to its neighbors, yet in practice has an active business link and endeavors that center on the proliferation of indiscriminate weapons, like drones, for example. It says a lot. There's a disconnect between the two. So, armed with reports like the one that that was written by Anna Stavrianiakis, sorry for that, but yeah, pun intended also for the armed. Activists, campaigners, and individuals are able to accurately describe a situation for which they are entitled answers and explanations to, the same way we at DED want to give students the information they need to go to their university administration and ask their university to demilitarize their education and focus on the real threats we face today. The climate crisis, the rampant racism and misogyny we have in our society, classism and ableism, I mean, you name it, whatever issue it is, we can address it. And I highly recommend that you go on our website, dead1.co, as we have a arms and universities database for which anyone can contribute to, really. Our point is to make this as collaborative as possible, and any bit of effort can go a really long way. Ultimately, we are all in this together, and the more of us there are, the easier, hopefully, it will be. So thank you so much for inviting me here to talk today and to represent DED. Our social media links are there, as I said, and you can also find me on socials. And yeah, cool. I'm gonna stop now. Thank you.
Melina, you're amazing. Thank you so much for such a powerful presentation. And I'm always so impressed by DED's graphics. I just don't understand how someone or a group can come up with such fantastic graphics. Okay, next, I'm super excited to introduce Greta. Greta has a background in issue-based community organizing. Her experience includes volunteer recruitment and engagement, event organizing, coalition building, legislative and media outreach, and public speaking. Greta graduated as valedictorian from St. Michael's College with a bachelor's degree in sociology and anthropology. She previously worked as a New York organizer for a leading nonprofit, Food and Water Watch. There, she campaigned on issues related to fracking, genetically engineered foods, climate change, and the corporate control of our common resources. Greta and her partner run Unadilla Community Farm, a nonprofit organic farm and permaculture education center in upstate New York. It sounds like many of the panelists wear multiple hats, and we're really excited to hear from you, Greta. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Bea, and thanks everyone. I'm glad to be joining you all today. So my name is Greta Zaro, and I'm the organizing director with World Beyond War. And I'm based in the United States, so I'm tasked today with reviewing some of the highlights of the World Peace Foundation's report on the US specifically, and importantly, given my background in organizing, discussing ways that we can take action on the issues that are addressed in the report. But first, let's review some of the report highlights, and some of these things you'll see are common themes throughout all the other reports that have already been discussed. So number one, we see that the US is the biggest arms supplier in the world. And similar to the other reports, we see that conflict in a region does little to alter the arms trade and to change the relationships that the US has with different countries that it's supplying arms to. We also see, again, similar to what we've seen in France and other countries, that in the United States, the president essentially has unrestricted power to make arms deals, and Congress has very little say. Even when Congress passed a war powers resolution to end US involvement in the war in Yemen, for example, Trump vetoed it. And likewise, on the international stage, there are a few checks and balances. For example, the United States did not ratify the UN Arms Trade Treaty. The report also makes clear from various case studies that economics, profiting from weapon sales, and politics, bolstering relationships with countries that we see as strategic allies, such as perhaps for oil or other interests, are the main drivers for arms exports, not legal or humanitarian concerns about how those arms are being used. So the US is also the biggest supplier of weapons to countries that are at war, according to the World Peace Foundation's analysis over the years 1990 to 2018. And I'll add to this to say that the US is not only leading in terms of the volume of weapons supplied, but it's also the biggest number of foreign military bases around the world. The US has approximately 95% of all foreign military bases. It has the biggest military budget worldwide, which is about $1 trillion US per year if you include all of the different military expenses, not just the Department of Defense, but other related departments. And so the US is really, in multiple senses, this leading military force worldwide. And as such, it must take the lead into de-escalation and disarmament, triggering a reverse arms race. Now, one thing that isn't mentioned in the report, which I thought was interesting to point out in this conversation, is the fact that the US provides military assistance to 73% of the world's dictatorships. And this is according to an original analysis that was done by Rich Whitney and published in Truth Out in 2017. And so not only is conflict in a region not a deterrent to US arms exports, but neither is the level of democracy or lack thereof in the countries that the US supplies arms to. And I think this is especially striking given the justification that is often used for US militarism and this notion of the US being the world's policeman and spreading democracy worldwide, while in fact we're engaging with the world's dictatorships. The report also highlights, in particular, the war in Yemen and the US's relationship with Saudi Arabia, since Saudi Arabia is the largest importer of US major conventional weapons. The Saudi-led coalition has bombed Yemeni markets, hospitals, and civilians, and yet the US and its allies have continued to export billions of dollars of arms to Saudi Arabia. This is a situation that the UN has called the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And later I'll share some examples of how we've been organizing in particular against this war. So the question now is, how can we take action to address these issues and tackle the arms trade? And my background is in grassroots organizing in particular, and providing people with the tools and the training to organize in their communities. And so today I'm going to give a very, very brief kind of organizing 101, showing different examples of nonviolent tactics that can be used to halt the arms trade. And I'll be sharing specifically from examples of World Beyond War's global work. And hopefully this will provide you some inspiration of ways that you can bring these reports to life in your own communities. So World Beyond War's billboard campaign is one tactic that combines education and action. The billboard with attention-grabbing facts, such as this one, which is just mind-boggling, the fact that 3% of US military spending could end starvation on Earth. We grab headlines with these billboards around the world. We raise awareness on these issues. And then on top of that, events at the billboard site, as you can see here, such as this rally with local community groups and elected officials, can amplify the billboard's impact and spur people to take action. And even when our billboards don't go up, such as in this case, where the company actually blocked our ad during Trump's visit to Ireland, we can still grab headlines. Ironically, even without the billboard, our message made it into the mainstream news in Ireland, drawing attention to the fact that Ireland is complicit with US war making, and US troops and weapons are funneled through Shannon Airport in Ireland, making their way to the Middle East. Beyond billboards and public education, Weapons deals are made with our tax dollars, and we can stand up to our governments and say how we want our taxes used instead. Liz Remerswal, World Beyond War's New Zealand chapter coordinator, did just that, and she initiated a campaign to oppose the New Zealand government's purchase of billions of dollars of fighter jets. She collected hundreds of signatures and organized a colorful rally outside of New Zealand's parliament. And you can see here the rally, and this was the delivery of the petition to representatives of the government. Now, petitioning our government to cancel arms deals is one tactic for curbing the arms trade. Another tactic is divestment, directly withdrawing investments from weapons manufacturers and military contractors. Divestment can be achieved at many levels, from switching your personal bank or changing where you invest your retirement funds, and then kind of scaling up from there, divesting institutional funds such as university endowments, or divesting municipal or state pension funds. And here in this short video clip, you see the Charlottesville, Virginia campaign that World Beyond War led. This was a successful campaign that divested the city's operating budget from both weapons and fossil fuels, tying in that intersectionality that Melina was talking about. And so city by city, we can scale up divestment, taking a direct hit at weapons companies' influence and profits, and stigmatizing the weapons trade in the process. Weaponsfreefunds.org is a searchable database that makes divestment easy, and you can type in a mutual fund company and you can see it ranked A through F in terms of how invested it is in weapons. don'tbankonthebomb.com/investors, and these links are being put in the chat, is another searchable database that allows you to search by financial institution, and you can see how those institutions invest in weapons companies, with a particular focus on nuclear weapons companies in this case, although you will see many of the same companies are also producers of conventional weapons. And so these two databases can be a starting point for launching a divestment campaign in your community. Now, the World Peace Foundation report highlights the war in Yemen and the role of Western governments in fueling that war by providing weapons and military assistance to the Saudi-led offensive. Cutting off Western support for the war has been a core focus of us at World Beyond War for the past several years. In particular, this photo shows a banner drop and a rally organized by World Beyond War Canada at the Deputy Prime Minister's office. This was part of a global day of action actually last month for the 7th anniversary of the war in Yemen. Canada manufactures armored vehicles, which are shipped to Saudi Arabia, and has provided billions of dollars of arms to Saudi Arabia. Now, when thinking about organizing around a certain issue, whether the arms trade or this could really apply to any other cause that you're passionate about, it's important that tactics are not done in isolation. Tactics should be part of a broader campaign strategy with a clear target. That's the decision maker who has the jurisdiction to enact the change that you want to see. And then tactics should be adjusted accordingly based on the target's responsiveness or lack thereof. In this way, tactics can escalate accordingly, always remaining nonviolent, but through creative ways, we can put increased pressure on the target to push for a response. And so here, this is an example of a more high-risk tactic, a direct action blockade of the railway, blocking General Dynamics armored vehicles that were bound for Saudi Arabia. Not only did activists call on the Canadian government to stop exports, but this action also draws attention to the industry-government collaboration. And by naming the company involved, in this case, General Dynamics, it calls on it to end its complicity in the war in Yemen. Here, World Beyond War Canada organizer Rachel Small literally put her body in front of a paddock transportation truck carrying armored vehicles that were bound for Saudi Arabia. Paddock's trucks were delayed for several hours by this action, and their office was flooded with calls. A great deal of attention was brought to the issue. And for the first time, actually, a Liberal member of Parliament broke with the government's position and supported publicly our demands. The dramatic action got international press coverage on Democracy Now!, CBC, Al Jazeera, and many more outlets, amplifying the impact of the action and bringing it to a global audience. And in fact, today, we're wrapping up a global mobilization to stop Lockheed Martin, which was a week of action targeted at the world's biggest weapons company. With over 100 endorsing groups worldwide, actions were organized around the world at Lockheed Martin facilities. From rallies, petition deliveries, creative street theater in South Korea, and much more, you can visit worldbeyondwar.org/stop Lockheed Martin, and you can see photos and videos of all of the actions that have been happening this week to stop the world's largest weapons company. And so I hope that this quick snapshot of various organizing tactics has inspired you and that you can adapt these ideas to take action locally in your area to hold weapons companies and governments to account. You can visit worldbeyondwar.org to get involved with our work, and please do reach out. We'd be happy to help support your campaigns. Thank you.
That was amazing, Greta. Thank you so much. It's always amazing to me how much work our organizations are doing together and separately. So we have received a bunch of questions, actually, so I am going to go ahead and get right to them. The first one is for Ruth and or others. Where have you seen effective activist interventions? Do you have examples of successful efforts to halt an arms trade because of allegations of corruption?
So one thing that we have to know about corruption in the arms trade is that it usually comes out years and years after the deal has been concluded. And so this is to ask about halting arms sales because of corruption is quite a difficult task. There have been in countries protests around corruption where it has been a massive issue, for example, in Israel. But I don't know of any particular campaigns that have stopped an ongoing sale because of allegations of corruption. If any of the other participants know of something, please correct me. I'm also not all knowing on this. I think Melina might have an example. And other than that, I guess in terms of just direct actions that worked, I guess Greta already made some examples, but we also have others. Of course, in Europe, for example, there were port workers blocking shipments of weapons to the Yemen-led coalition, where sometimes ships had to leave the port empty because the dock workers and civil society protests were blocking the shipments.
Go ahead, Melina.
Yeah, I was just gonna, I actually don't, it's not that I have an example of like one that got blocked right away, but I think the reason also why we find out about the corrupt nature of these kinds of deals way down the line is because of like the veil of secrecy that is apparently required for national security, right? So it ends up coming out down the line because ultimately it doesn't pose as much of a threat anymore. But if we knew about the sales as they were happening, I'm sure that we would have a lot more I would hope so anyway, that we'd have a lot more like outrage and momentum generated from the public as opposed to like, well, it happened 20 years ago. You know, who cares? We care.
Yes, many of us care. Do any of the other panelists want to speak to this particular question? Okay, great. Let's go to the next one. This one is specifically for Alice. In the recent French elections, did the arms trade or French strategic relations with its major arms trade partners or the war in Yemen come up at all as an issue?
Well, at the beginning of the election, it was not a subject, but actually no international relations or affairs were mentioned as something worth campaigning about. But it all changed with the Russian invasion, of course, which made the transfer of weapons an important issue, but also the role of the EU and the fact that the EU was sending weapons, etc. So that was interesting, but it was not enough to actually, to get a good debate in the public opinion, because the candidates, they already had their programs ready and they were all about security at the national level, the usual subjects. But it was interesting to see that one candidate actually wanted to put more control and transparency, the candidate for the Greens. But other than that, it was very much focused at the national level, and yeah, it was a bit disappointing in that regard.
Yes, very disappointing. Do any of the other panelists have any kind of information that they want to share about their observations on the French elections? Okay, great. So this next question is for Ruth. In your presentation, you mentioned strategic litigation. Can you tell us what that is, and can you give maybe an example of that?
Yes, one of my favorite subjects. So strategic litigation is basically you bring cases in national courts against specific arms deals that help draw attention to the issue and that hopefully have an effect in halting a certain government policy. So I think Yemen is a great example where in the UK, in France, and in Italy, at least, I think there's at least one or two more countries where we've seen normally like non-governmental organizations, specifically the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, but also the Campaign Against Arms Trade in the UK, for example, bringing court cases where they basically sue their governments on the basis of their own commitments, right? And some of these cases have been dragging on for years. In the UK, the case that CAT brought against the government actually halted or almost halted UK arms exports to Saudi Arabia for a year, and except for the government still continuing to sell on like three or four instances, which they later had to admit was wrong. So yeah, so there are examples of when this worked. In other countries, I myself am German. In Germany, we do not have that option to sue our governments for over their licensing procedures. But here, for example, we sue the government, we sue companies for illegal arms exports when they come to light. And this often also helps us with political mobilization and, of course, in pointing out gaps in arms export control legislation. Yeah, for example, end user agreements, where in one of these cases, it became clear that end user agreements, which is something that Western governments always rely on. They say, oh, we have end user agreements, so these weapons can't actually end up in the wrong hands, right? And we could, like this, the court basically said, no, end user agreements are not part of the export license. So what this company did in selling to someone where they knew the arms wouldn't end up where they were supposed to wasn't illegal, it was illegal for other reasons, but not illegal on that count, which is just ridiculous. So these kinds of things can really come out through strategic litigation.
Are there any other comments about strategic litigation? Great. So our next question is a really good one. And I think that I would love to hear more than one of the panelists speak about it if they are comfortable. So the question is, what do the panelists say about the double standards between GOV's answer to the war in Ukraine and other conflict areas around the world?
Well, there's a lot of things to say. I'm not gonna just state the obvious, that obviously when the conflict is far and in the global south and concerns people that don't look like your historical European, I'll say that way, Caucasian European, then it's a different story. I've been having this conversation with a friend of mine from high school, actually, who's a journalist, and he is very frustrated at the fact that he sees other journalists, call out Russian aggression when it comes to Ukraine, but they've never called out Russian aggression when it comes to, the rest. Like, there's no, you know what I mean? Like, where's that energy and that momentum? And I think obviously this double standard is something that we see not just when it comes to conflict and arms manufacturing and transfers. There's like all of our trash is somewhere on an island near Indonesia, and there's like landfill mountains of like clothes in South America. I mean, it's obvious that we and I say we because I live in the West, and I am also like I'm half French, so it also concerns me. But you know, we view ourselves and our countries, I want to say, as like, you know, we're at the center of things, and then like things revolve around us, when in reality it is not the case at all. And we actually would not be where we are at today in the West had it not been for the exploitation and pillage that was done by our ancestors in places that we now call it the global South or wherever else. So I'm not surprised at the double standard. I was expecting it. I was waiting for it. We saw it when ISIS was carrying out a ton of bombings in 2015, 2016 across Europe. I was one of those people that was going pray for Paris when really I should have been praying for Syria and praying for Cameroon and whatnot. Like, but at least we have this awareness right now. So I feel like hopefully we can get to a place where we don't repeat the same kind of narratives in that sense.
I completely agree, Melina. Alice, would you like to also speak about this particular question?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree with everything Melina said. And I think maybe the most frustrating aspect of it is that for once you have all the media and the discussion that are actually on the arms trade, and it's still not about how to actually build peace. How can we prevent conflict? How can we avoid diversion of small arms that is going to happen like it happened in 2014 in Ukraine? So I think the issue is that you have this media focus, but it's still not from a different angle, from like a place where civil society could have an opinion about several aspects of it with the right informations, and we could actually get a discussion with everyone and also include the people we didn't talk enough about. So Syria, they have so much knowledge due to their experience about arms trade, and we should listen to them when it comes to Ukraine. So yeah, that's, I think, the most frustrating point is I want to use the media focus right now, but it's still not from the right perspective.
Again, I completely agree, Alice. Ruth, I see that you have your hand up. Would you like to speak to this as well?
Yeah, I think one of the things that frustrate me the most with this is that when you bring up the fact that a lot of the politicians who are now calling for an armament of like Ukraine arms exports to technically they're not arms exports in the sense that we've been talking about today. Actually, that's something we should probably clarify. The exports that we're seeing to Ukraine at the moment are government to government transfers. These are often normally the like stockpiles of the of national governments, and they're gifting them to Ukraine. I also saw a question in the chat somewhere in the UK on this, I think. They're gifting them to Ukraine. So these are not arms sales in your particular sense. These are not even the things that we're talking about today. These are not even the things that we're seeing. So these are not commercial sales in that sense. So that's one thing that that's as background. But like what frustrates me about this is that when you point out that these are the same people that not only didn't blink an eye when Yemeni civilians were bombed or Libyan civilians were bombed, but actively encouraged the sale of weapons to these countries that were doing the bombing and are continuing to do the bombing now in Iraqi Kurdistan, for example. And so I think it's what's frustrating about this to me is that when these facts are now brought up, when other cases of arms ending up in conflict areas are brought up at the moment, this is that you're accused of whataboutism. And I think that this is a very unfair allegation because this is not something that we only started saying now, and it's not something that should discourage like Ukrainians or anything, or like devalue Ukrainian lives. It's something that we've been saying for years and years, and that only now people are picking up on and are saying, this is, how can you say this? This is whataboutism. Anna Stavrianakis actually made a really nice point about this in the presentation of her report, her World Peace Foundation report, where she says for her, it's not Ukraine, but what about Yemen? but it's Ukraine and Yemen. We have to look at both of these things, and the lives in both of these places matter.
Absolutely. Ugh, our panelists, just completely brilliant. Does anybody else want to speak to this particular question, or should we move on to the next? Oh, I saw Greta's mute button.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with everything that's been said, and World Beyond War has also been doing that work of trying to contextualize the situation in terms of the other conflicts that are going on, in terms of the role of NATO over the past several decades, et cetera. And I think, that was one of the primary reasons why World Beyond War was founded, was this notion of not just opposing what we call the war of the day, but really creating a larger conversation across all time of the need for a complete overhaul and, the abolition of the institution of war. So absolutely agree, and that's fundamental to what we're trying to do.
Excellent, excellent. So we have actually quite a few questions left. So the next one is also for Alice. You noted that your organization is fairly new in 2017. Are there others working on these particular issues in France?
Yeah, I mean, not a lot, but there are. So there's Amnesty has done a lot of work, especially after the article from Disclose revealing that there was French arms used against civilians in Yemen. They launched a campaign to highlight the silence and the lack of transparency, the lack of control for those exports. And they actually managed to involve quite considerable number of young people. So it was really nice. And I also heard a lot about arms trade when I was a student because of them. And there is ACER, so the association that is suing the French state right now. So they are not mobilizing, or they're not on social media. They are really doing a lot of legal work, which is so needed. They are doing a lot of research. It's so difficult to get independent research on French arms and French exports. Everything is funded by the Minister of Defense. So then, yeah, well, you can't have an independent research, but yeah, so there are several. Sometimes you have also the humanitarian NGO that are coming together when it comes to protection of civilians. It's always really helpful because you have huge international organizations, but we are trying to do more education for the young people, not only the young people, but we're on social media, we're doing like podcasts, videos, exhibitions. So yeah, we're trying to mobilize on the ground. So then, like, for example, Amnesty can pick it up and do the advocacy work like hard at the parliament, because you need a lot of resources for that. But yeah, trying to help each other in this difficult field.
Thank you so much for answering that particular question. So we were asked another question, but I'm going to go ahead and send it to Melina, since you were speaking on UK arms exports. Melina, could you speak a little bit about the particular arms companies that have been involved in British arming of Ukraine, and any relevant personal relationship between arms dealers and sitting UK MPs?
So I can tell you that BAE Systems share price, or stock price, or whatever the investment term is, I'm not a financial person, their pricing on the market skyrocketed the day that the invasion started. So if that doesn't tell you anything, like, you know what I mean, it's pretty damning. And then in terms of like personal relationships, I'm going to direct you to the Campaign Against Arms Trade website, because they have a really wonderful resource that basically explains the revolving door system, which is in essence that revolving door between higher up executives that are in arms companies that then end up working in parliament or for parliamentary groups, and then vice versa, and keep going back and forth. So it really is just like this small elite group of people. And I say elite not because they're amazing, but just because they apparently have like all this power that we're not entitled to ever have, that are sharing the roles year by year. And yeah, B put it in the list. And yeah, same with Thales. I feel like every arms company almost just had their, at least in the West, everyone just saw mad profits happen that day. And that should tell you just what you need to know about the situation. Like, it's not that it's got nothing to do with democracy or people's freedoms, but like ultimately war makes people money. So yeah.
Ruth, I see your hand up. Do you want to also speak to this particular?
Yeah, just very quickly, to reiterate that the exports that are made right now are not themselves sales. They will lead to sales as we see increased defense budgets across the Western world. They will also lead to countries replenishing their arsenals after like sending parts of their arsenals to Ukraine. I just wanted to put in the chat an article by Open Democracy that that names some of the House of Lords members that have personally profited from the BAE Systems stock price rising.
Excellent. Thank you for the responses to that question. Greta, we have 3 questions for you, but they're all somewhat related. So I'm just going to go ahead and read them off. And if I need to do that again, just let me know. So the first question is, how have you been expanding your audience? The second, what communities have been most responsive to the demilitarizing message? And the third, are you drawing on existing groups or pulling individuals into your group or into your work?
Yeah, that's a lot to tackle. We'll see what we can cover. So in terms of expanding the audience, I mean, that's the work that we do every single day. There's kind of this expression in grassroots organizing that if you're not growing, you're shrinking, meaning that you always need to be growing, that all of our work hinges on being able to reach out to people and mobilize them and give them a voice and give them the tools to take action. And World Beyond War's work in particular falls into these 2 buckets of education and action. So, in terms of, how do we expand our audience? We do that in a lot of different ways. It might be through the education side in terms of like running online courses, of which we run about 4 a year, webinars that we do like every month, podcast, fact sheets, articles, etc. Webinars like this. And I think also, some of the photos that I showed of the direct actions and then the media coverage that they garner, that's another way that we're able to expand our audience and draw people in when they see that kind of coverage and that dramatic action. In terms of what communities are sort of drawn to this work, we're a global network, so it's hard to sort of generalize because it really depends. We have, of course, a lot of people in areas where they're directly impacted by war or militarism, and that takes many forms. That might be, for example, our Cameroon chapter that is experiencing violent conflict right now and dealing with that, or it might be like somewhat secondary but still direct impact in terms of like living in a community that has a military base that it's polluting your water and you can't drink the water, which is a huge issue that we could unpack, and so, or living near a weapons industry manufacturer. So I would say there's a lot of people that reach out to us that have that kind of direct impact and want to organize locally to shut down that base or shut down that manufacturing facility in their area. And then beyond that, there's a lot of people who then sort of make the broader connections. They might not be directly impacted, but they see how, in fact, every one of us is directly impacted, because, even if you are not, passionate about ending war, or you do not have a direct experience of war, your tax dollars are going towards war and going towards these weapon sales. Or, you might be really passionate, for example, about climate change or healthcare or other major issues. And so we need to redirect that money towards those issues. So that's part of our work at World Beyond War, is sort of to connect the dots and say, even if you don't actually care that much about war, which we hope we can motivate you to care about this, the issue that you care about is probably linked in some way to militarism, either directly or indirectly through the loss of money that could be going towards your issue. And of course, the whole environmental thing, which we haven't even talked about, the fact that the military is one of the biggest polluters on the planet. So if your cause is climate change, then your cause should also be anti-militarism. So hopefully that in a nutshell tries to answer that part of the question. And I guess the last question in terms of sort of, are we networking with other groups? Absolutely. World Beyond War is considered a network. So we have both what's called chapters, which take on the name of World Beyond War, like World Beyond War Cameroon, etc. And those kind of take on our name and our logo and our brand. But then we also have affiliates, of which Stop Fueling War actually just signed on to be an affiliate. We'll be adding you to the website soon. And so we have affiliates which, have their own name and have their own mission and brand. And so we partner with them. And in that way, we list those groups on our website too. And I'll make just a last plug, which is for our Peace Pledge, which is kind of our mission statement that lays out, why we're doing all of this and the impact of war and why we want to abolish war. And that Peace Pledge can be signed by both individuals and organizations. So you can also go to the website and see it's over 700 organizations. We have them all in a map that have signed on. And so you can check out those organizations in your area too. Thanks.
Amazing. We have a couple more questions, so we'll be quick. This one I think is really important to ask, and it's to the general panel. Hi, everyone. Thank you for this great event and presentations from all the speakers. Could you speak about the attempts by national governments to try and criminalize campaigns to end arms trades to brutal regimes, such as the campaign against arm trade and Palestine Solidarity Campaign being put on extremist lists by the UK government in 2020, and the importance of solidarity among civil society movements? Thank you. Who wants to tackle this question first?
I'll go first, because I was genuinely worried Jinsella and myself were going to end up on that list when it came out, because we work with basically half of what that left-wing extremism part of that. I mean, it was ridiculous. Anyway, let's keep it short and sweet. Obviously, there's a lot to say about these attempts. Quite frankly, it's coming from a place where obviously, like, I don't want to say obviously, but it's kind of obvious to me that we're bringing truth, we're bringing light to some truth in what we're doing, which is why there is this, why there are these attempts to silence us in essence. And, the moment that you have, I mean, the French Revolution, the moment that you have the public together and ready to like tear some heads down, they will do it. So the best way that you can stop that from happening is making sure that like you paint, there's a public portrayal of groups that are a threat to you and a threat to your established balance of power, to paint them in a way that is obviously not helpful. There's also, in the context of the UK as well, there's also the fact that like there's currently the policing bill that is still in Parliament that hasn't been passed yet, which would effectively criminalize all sorts of protesting and our right to our free speech and to our right to assembly. And it's quite terrifying to think that like if it's just the two of you playing music somewhere in a square, it might be seen as reason to stop and arrest you. So it is quite terrifying, but at the same time, I do think that the more they try to enforce these things, the more ridiculous it comes out and looks like. So yeah, I think that's kind of like, again, in theory it might sound appealing to some people, but then the practice of it is going to shine a light on how draconian and ridiculous it really is to try and do all that.
Amazing, Melina. Alice, did you want to speak to this?
Yeah, I mean, in France also, like the small NGO that sued the state, they are like 5 people, and they got the special service interrogating them because they used confidential data that were published by journalists for the case. So they tried to be intimidated. And then we had also parliamentaries like saying that association or NGOs that disagree with the French arms exports, but that are funded by foreigners or foreign entities, are not working for French interests, blah, 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 which is easy to say when no one is going to fund you in France. But yeah, I think it's also maybe something that we should use as a strength, because I'm only thinking that if they react like that, it's just for the feminist movement or any kind of progressive movement that you get like backfire because you're actually making improvements. You're moving forward, and they just want to stop you, but you are moving forward. So I always think that even if they are doing that, we should definitely be very like linked with each other, highlight it, say that it's not okay, but then we can move forward because they just want us to stop. So yeah, that's also a good sign.
Yes, I agree with you, Alice. Is there any other responses to this particular question? Okay, so we have a couple of more that are to specific.
Sam just put something in the chat on this that might be worth mentioning.
Okay, so Sam Perlow Freeman, who works with the campaign against arms trade, put, to clarify, CAT and PSC were not put on an official extremist list by the UK government. The document in question was from a particular local police force, which had logos of a wide range of organizations in different categories, such as left-wing, environmentalist, animal rights organization, as well as far right, as examples of potentially extremist organizations or campaigns. Its exact status was not clear, and it was subsequently withdrawn. It is still extremely worrying and is an example of the way the police seeks to infiltrate and repress groups campaigning for change. However, it is not correct to say that any sort of official government list of extremist organizations. Thank you so much for that clarification, Sam. And as usual, you're so articulate in your responses. So we're going to just have two more questions. So the next one is to Alice. So the question is, Alice hinted that the re-election might not be a positive development regarding France's sustained involvement in the arms trade. What about the Le Pen alternative?
Yeah, I mean, both are bad, just to make it simple. Yeah, Le Pen is horrible. It's fascism, so thank God we avoided that. Probably not for long, but we're going to work on that in our own political life. But unfortunately, for everything that relates to the military or arms, Macron is not helpful, and I wish he was more, or at least more, he was open to discussions or any change or anything. But he voted during his mandate like a law that gave that doubled the budget of the military, so it's going to reach 50 billions in 2025. And he started his campaign saying that if he got reelected, he will give even more, as if we need that. Then the education, the environment, no, just the military. So yeah, I think we need to highlight that it's not what we want. Le Pen is not, it's out of the question, but we can hope for better than those two options.
Thank you, Alice. And then our last question. First of all, thank you so much for all of your incredible questions. These have just been fantastic. Melina, how does demilitarized education deal with problems of unemployment if a factory shuts down? And is it a problem?
I mean, it is a problem, but we're not the ones manufacturing weapons, are we? So, no, I'm kidding. No, I mean, it is a problem, and it's a good question to ask because obviously, yes, there are people whose jobs, whose livelihoods rely on the jobs that they have in those industries. And actually, a problem that we have here in the UK is that a lot of these arms companies and manufacturers exist in small towns where they are often one of the biggest sources of employment. But I will direct you to the Lucas Plan, which is a wonderful initiative that was started in the 70s, unfortunately never came to fruition, but it is, in essence, it tells the story of the Lucas aerospace plant that was about to be shut down, and the entire, all of the workers basically were like, hi, we all have transferable skills. Like, we came up with this list of 100 something other products for social good that we actually could make. So we don't need to shut down. We can just redirect what we do. And unfortunately, that was not done, and the plant was shut down, and those people lost their jobs, and the plan for social good was never put to use. But it has, I see it as setting a precedent that it's obviously not inconceivable to think of people making other things outside of weapons if you're an engineer. Even during the pandemic, Raytheon started making ventilators. So clearly you have the skill set, your workers have the skill set to do something else. And it's up to our governments. You know, it was put in the chat earlier, I forget by who, I'm sorry about that, but you know, that governments do rely also on like government subsidies, and ultimately it's our tax money that's going towards these subsidies. So it would be nice to see our tax money going to subsidies, not to arms companies, but like if the Elbit factory in Oldham in Greater Manchester shuts down, we can redirect the people that used to work there to, you know, manufacture something else that would actually go to the benefit of Oldham and the Greater Manchester area, and probably the UK as a whole. So unemployment is not something that demilitarized education focuses on, because in our head, we are not the ones to, you know, we're just out here highlighting a problem. And thank you, Nicola. The new Lucas plan exactly is alive and well now. But yeah, that's that.
Amazing. Well, on behalf of the World Peace Foundation, I just want to sincerely thank all of our panelists today. I'm just continually impressed by all of you, and thank you so much for your amazing presentations today. And also to thank our audience for sticking with us and asking these really imperative questions. So we will hopefully be hosting another youth panel again at some point in the future, because I think it's just absolutely important that we get these perspectives and that we really talk about concrete changes to our world. Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful day. Take care.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Bea and Bridget and everyone at the World Peace Foundation.
Yeah, thank you so much for providing us such a nice platform.
Thank you. Everything that Ruth and Alice said.